June 18, 1815, a man stands on a ridge south of Brussels and looks north. He has stood in moments like this before, and his calculations changed the world. Egypt, Italy, Prussia, Austria, Russia, 20 years of it. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte, and this morning, for the first time in his life, there is something in his face that the men around him had never seen before. Doubt. He returned from exile on the island of Elba just 90 days ago. He landed in the south of France with 1,000 men and marched north. And every regiment sent to stop him joined him instead. King Louis XVIII fled. Paris erupted. The emperor was back. Europe reached for its weapons. 7 nations mobilized against him. Napoleon's answer was what it always was: move fast, hit first, don't give them time to think. Strike into Belgium, destroy the Allied army separately before they could unite and crush him together. He had 3 days to make it work. He got 2. Today is the 3rd day. On the ridge to the north, behind a road lined with elm trees, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, is waiting. To the east, the battered but unbroken army of Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher is marching on the sound of guns. And somewhere to Napoleon's right, 33,000 French soldiers are moving in exactly the wrong direction. What happens in the next 8 hours will determine whether the French Empire survives or collapses, whether Napoleon Bonaparte dies an emperor or a prisoner. This is Waterloo, the last gamble, and it was closer than history remembers. I am Benito, and welcome to the Jacked Historian. For 15 years, Napoleon Bonaparte had dominated Europe in a way no single leader had since ancient Rome. He reorganized France after the chaos of the French Revolution, wrote a legal code that still underpins the law of much of the world, and built an empire stretching from Spain to the borders of Russia. Every major power that opposed him on the battlefield had been beaten by him at least once. Britain, the one power he could never quite reach, he forced to fight on the margins while he reorganized everything else. But the empire contained the seeds of its own destruction. The continental system, his attempt to strangle British trade by closing European ports, ruined French allies and pushed neutral states toward Britain. The Peninsular War in Spain bled the French army for 6 years in a guerrilla conflict that never resolved. And in 1812, the invasion of Russia, launched with hundreds of thousands of men, returned with a fraction of them. The army that had conquered Europe was gone. The coalition closed in. By April 1814, Paris had fallen. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba, a small sovereignty off the Italian coast, close enough to France to observe its politics, far enough that the victors believed he was finished. Well, he was not finished. The restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII was deeply unpopular, with veterans, with the peasantry, with a nation that had spent 20 years remaking the world and now felt humiliated by the settlement. Napoleon watched all of this from Elba with characteristic impatience. On February 26, 1815, he escaped with about 8,000 soldiers, landed on the southern coast of France and marched north. The government sent regiment after regiment to arrest him. At Grenoble, Napoleon reportedly walked ahead of his escort, opened his coat, and invited any man who wished to shoot his emperor to do so. Not a shot was fired. The regiment joined him. So did the next one, and the next one. On March 20th, Napoleon walked into the Tuileries Palace as Louis XVIII walked out the other side. The 100 days had begun. Europe's response was immediate. The Congress of Vienna, already meeting to redraw the post-Napoleonic map, declared Napoleon an outlaw and mobilized the Seventh Coalition. Wellington would command a multinational Anglo-Allied army in Belgium, and Blücher would command the Prussian army of the Lower Rhine. A massive Austrian force and a Russian army were moving from the east, but they were weeks away. Napoleon's only chance was speed, strike into Belgium before Wellington and Blücher could unite, defeat them separately, and shatter the coalition's political will before the Austrians and Russians arrived. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was 46 years old and the most experienced British commander of his generation. A decade in the Peninsular War had shaped a particular style. Not the decisive offensive stroke, but careful ground selection, economy of force, and a patient wearing down of opponents who underestimated him. He was deeply worried about the army he had been given for Belgium. Many of his best peninsular veterans had been shipped to America. He called his new force an infamous army. A mixed contingent of British regulars, Dutch, Belgian troops, Hanoverian militia, and veterans of the King's German Legion, whose reliability varied enormously. Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher had been a soldier for more than 50 years and was known throughout the Prussian army as Marschall Vorwärts, Marshal Forward. Where Wellington was deliberate, Blücher was aggressive to the point of recklessness. He had been badly beaten by Napoleon before, and 2 days from now he will be again battered, bruised, and 72 years old. He was also at this very moment marching his army toward the sound of the guns. Driven by a promise he had made to Wellington, if Napoleon attacked before the Prussians could concentrate, Blücher would come. That promise, and whether it would be kept, would determine everything. Napoleon crossed the Belgian frontier on June 15th with approximately 120,000 men, the Armée du Nord. He moved fast enough to catch Wellington completely off guard, and by the time Wellington's orders went out, French forces had already crossed the Sambre River. Wellington ordered his army to march immediately. Napoleon's immediate objective was the road junction at Quatre Bras, a crossroad sitting between Wellington's scattered forces and Blücher's Prussians. Seize it, and the two allied armies would be physically separated, unable to support each other. He sent Marshal Michel Ney with the left wing to take it. On June 16th, Napoleon attacked Blücher's Prussians at the village of Ligny, one of the last battles he would personally direct. It was a hard, grinding fight across a stream and through burning villages that lasted most of the afternoon. Napoleon's plan was to pin the Prussians frontally, while d'Erlon's First Corps swung wide to smash the flank. The flanking attack never happened. d'Erlon's corps, 20,000 men, spent most of the day marching back and forth between Ligny and Quatre Bras, sent first to one battlefield and then the other by conflicting orders, arriving at neither in time to make a difference. It was a catastrophic coordination failure on the campaign's opening day. Ligny was still a French victory. Blücher's army took somewhere between 12,000 and 16,000 casualties. Blücher himself was thrown from his horse in the rout, trapped beneath the dying animal, and ridden over by French lancers before his aide could drag him to safety. He came within minutes of being killed or captured. The Prussians retreated. But they retreated northeast, toward the town of Wavre, not east toward their own supply lines. That single choice kept them within a day's march of Wellington. Blücher's chief of staff, August von Gneisenau, made the call while Blücher was still recovering. Blücher, once back on his feet, endorsed it without hesitation. Nobody on either side understood yet what the decision had just done. While Napoleon was fighting Blucher at Ligny, Marshal Ney had a simple job: take the Catastrophic crossroad. He had the men to do it. He had the time to do it. What he lacked was the decision to commit everything at once. He hesitated, fed his troops into the fight one unit at a time, and by the time he pushed his full strength forward, enough Allied troops had arrived that the position held. Napoleon had won a battle and stalled at a crossroad. Both Allied armies were still in the field, separated and shaken, but intact and still capable of finding each other. The Austrian and Russian armies were marching from the east. He had 2 days before the numbers became impossible. On the morning of June 17th, Napoleon made the decision that would haunt the rest of the campaign. He detached Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy with 33,000 men and sent him east to pursue the Prussians. Grouchy had only recently been elevated from cavalry command to full marshal. His orders: follow them, keep them away from Wellington, and prevent them from rejoining the main fight. Grouchy was a capable cavalry commander, but he had never independently led a large mixed force of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and he followed orders with a rigidity that would prove catastrophic. Grouchy moved without urgency and without answers. A full day passed before he confirmed that Blucher was heading to Wavre rather than east toward his own supply lines. On the morning of June 18th, as the guns began firing at Waterloo, 12 miles to the west, Grouchy sat at breakfast in the village of Valhaine. His subordinate, General Gerard, heard the distant cannon, went outside, listened, and came back in. He urged Grouchy directly: "Marchez au canon!" March toward the guns. Whatever Napoleon was fighting, 33,000 men could only help. Grouchy refused. His orders were to pursue the Prussians to Wavre. His orders said nothing about Waterloo. He would follow his orders. He marched to Wavre, fought a pointless engagement against a Prussian rearguard, and received word of what had happened at Waterloo the following morning. Napoleon fought the decisive battle of his career with 33,000 of his best soldiers marching in circles 12 miles away. On June 17, Wellington withdrew his army north along the Brussels road to a ridge he had already marked as the right ground, high enough to shelter troops on the reverse slope, anchored by 2 fortified positions his men could hold, and narrow enough that Napoleon could not easily go around him. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, just south of the village of Waterloo, was a low plateau running east to west, with the Brussels road cutting straight through the middle. Behind it, troops could shelter from artillery fire, invisible to the enemy below. In front of it, 2 positions had to hold. On the right, Hougoumont, a large chateau enclosed by stone walls. At the center, sitting directly across the Brussels road, stood La Haye Sainte, a solid stone farmhouse. Anyone coming up that road had to go through it. Wellington placed his 68,000 men and 156 guns along the ridge, his strongest units anchoring the center and the right. That night, the rain came down hard and did not stop. Soldiers of both armies huddled in the mud, unable to light fires, soaked through in the dark. One King's German Legion officer wrote in his diary that when dawn came, he witnessed a mass of misery. And that was the army that was about to fight the most important battle of the century. For Napoleon, the rain created a clear tactical problem. His artillery required firm ground. Cannon wheels sank in mud. Recoil buried the trail. Shot that hit wet ground buried itself rather than skipping and bouncing through the enemy formations the way it was meant to. He delayed his assault until late morning, waiting for the ground to firm. It was a reasonable decision, and it was also a decision that gave Blucher the time he needed to arrive. Wellington spent much of the night on horseback, riding the line. Those who rode with him recorded a man who had made his calculations and gone quiet. He told an officer before dawn, "I don't think it will do." Then he paused. "But we must try." Napoleon, at his headquarters at Le Caillou farmhouse 3 miles south, was in better spirits. When his chief of staff, Marshal Soult, warned that Wellington was a formidable opponent who had never been beaten, Napoleon reportedly dismissed it. And here I will try to portray Napoleon as I imagine he said that. "I'll tell you, Wellington is a bad general. The English are bad troops, and this affair is nothing more than eating breakfast." He was, in this respect, about to be corrected. By the morning of June 18th, the two armies faced each other across a valley roughly a mile wide. Napoleon had approximately 72,000 men and 246 guns. Wellington had approximately 68,000 men and 156 guns, mixed in quality but carefully positioned. The asymmetry was simple. Napoleon had to attack uphill into a prepared defense. Wellington had only to hold until Blucher arrived. Napoleon's assault began at approximately 11:30 in the morning. The battle opened not with Napoleon's main assault, but with a diversion. Jérôme Bonaparte, Napoleon's youngest brother, commanded the division ordered to attack Hougoumont, the fortified chateau on Wellington's right flank. The intention was to draw Allied reserves away from the center before the main blow fell. It was a sound idea. What followed was a catastrophe for France. Hougoumont was defended by light companies of the British Guard, supported by Nassauers and Hanoverians. The chateau's stone walls had been loopholed for musket fire. The gates were heavy timber. It was a miniature fortress that a small number of determined men could hold against a much larger force, provided they did not lose the gates. Once they nearly did. Shortly after noon, a party of French soldiers led by a Sioux lieutenant named Legros, nicknamed L'Enforceur, the Smasher, broke through the north gate with an axe and fought their way inside. The compound was being overrun. Then a handful of British Guardsmen, led by Corporal James Graham, threw their weight against the gate, forcing it to shut on the men still pressing through. The soldiers who had broken through were killed almost to a man. The gate held. Jérôme kept attacking. He committed division after division to the woods and walls of Hougoumont throughout the afternoon, far beyond what the tactical situation required. What had been planned as a destruction became a drain. Up to 14,000 French soldiers spent the day at Hougoumont, and none of them were available when Napoleon needed every man he had. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, Napoleon launched his main infantry attack. General Jean-Baptiste d'Erlon's First Corps advanced in massive columns up the slope toward the Allied center left. The attack was initially devastating. The columns broke through a Dutch-Belgian brigade, posted forward on the ridge, and began cresting the high ground. General Thomas Picton was killed at this moment, shot through the head as he urged his division into the oncoming French columns. But almost no one on the field knew. Picton had been fighting all morning with a serious chest wound sustained at Quatre-Bras 2 days earlier, and he told no one. For a moment, the ridge was genuinely threatened. Then, Lord Uxbridge, Wellington's cavalry commander, unleashed the heavy brigades. The Household Brigade crashed into the French columns on the left. The Union Brigade charged on the right. The effect of their lawns, tightly packed formations was catastrophic. Infantry in dense columns cannot maneuver against cavalry. The columns disintegrated. The Scots Greys rode so deep into the French lines that they reached and captured the Eagle, the regimental standard of the 45th Regiment of the line. Their lawn corps streamed back down the slope. And then the British cavalry kept going. Flushed with success and impossible to stop, the heavy brigades rode on the French battery positions, sabering gunners, spiking cannon, and riding until their horses were blown. Major General William Ponsonby, commanding the Union Brigade, was cut down and killed in the pursuit. The Union Brigade lost roughly half its strength in the charge and the pursuit combined. Britain's finest heavy cavalry had broken the main French infantry assault, and then largely destroyed itself in the process. It was not yet 3 o'clock, and Napoleon had spent his primary offensive infantry for the day. Marshal Michel Ney was called the bravest of the brave by Napoleon himself, a title earned in his 20 years of warfare. He was also in this particular afternoon making the worst decisions of his career. Around 3:30, Ney observed movement of the Allied ridge, artillery being withdrawn, troops shifting position. He interpreted it as the beginning of a retreat. It was not. Wellington was moving his guns to safety and rotating exhausted units. But Ney saw retreat, and he reached with characteristic aggression. He launched the cavalry. Without orders from Napoleon, without infantry support, without coordinating the horse artillery that could have broken up a light formation before the horsemen arrived, he sent nearly 10,000 cavalry up the slope in one of the largest unsupported cavalry charges in the history of warfare. Captain Cavalier Mercier of the Royal Horse Artillery described in his journal how the first warning was not sight but sensation. The ridge trembling beneath his feet before the first horseman appeared over the crest. Wellington's infantry did what trained infantry does against unsupported cavalry. They formed squares, compact formation, 4 ranks deep, bayonets bristling outward at every face. A cavalry horse will not charge into a solid wall of bayonets. The squares were impervious, provided they held, and provided no French infantry arrived to break them open. No French infantry arrived. No horse artillery moved to close range. Wave after wave of cavalry circled and broke around the squares, taking musket fire from 4 sides simultaneously. The squares held. The horses fell. Then the cavalry pulled back, reformed, and charged again and again and again. By the time the charges finally ended, Ney had thrown his finest cavalry at unbroken infantry and achieved nothing except the destruction of a force that could never be replaced. The Allied line had bent, it had not broken. Major George Bering and approximately 400 men of the King's German Legion had been holding the farmhouse since noon. He had sent messenger after messenger requesting resupply. None ever arrived. When the last rounds were fired, his men fixed bayonets and held the gates a few minutes longer. Then the French were through. Bering pulled out with barely 40 men of his original 400. Never, he wrote afterwards, had I felt myself so cut to the soul. The consequences were immediate. French skirmishers and artillery moved up to the farmhouse and began firing directly into the Allied center at close range. Several Allied units began to break. Wellington had no reserves left. He was moving troops from his flanks to plug gaps in the center. Napoleon, presented with an open center and a collapsing Allied line, could not fully exploit it. His infantry was exhausted. Their lawn corps was still reforming. The cavalry had destroyed itself on the squares. The only fresh force he had left was the Imperial Guard, and he was not yet ready to commit it. The window lasted perhaps 30 minutes. It closed when the Prussians arrived. Blucher promised Wellington he would come. He was 72 years old and still bruised from being trampled by French cavalry 2 days earlier, but he came anyway. French-Prussian forces, troops that had not fought at Ligny, began appearing on Napoleon's right flank from around 4:30 in the afternoon. By 6 o'clock, as La Haye Sainte was falling in the center, significant Prussian forces were pressing hard on the French right. Napoleon was now fighting two separate battles simultaneously. The village of Plancenoit, directly behind Napoleon's right flank, became the hinge of his defensive crisis. If the Prussians took it, they could be behind the main French line, cutting off the road south and threatening to surround the entire army. Napoleon diverted his troops from his main attack to hold it. First, the Young Guard, then 2 battalions of the Old Guard itself, the most precious infantry of his army. The Old Guard retook Plancenoit in a single devastating assault, but the pressure was relentless. More Prussians were arriving by the hour. Napoleon had 1 card left, and he played it. The Imperial Guard was not merely a military unit, it was an institution. Created by Napoleon in 1804 and expanded through a decade of warfare, the Guard was the finest body of soldiers in French service. Its battalions were filled with veterans selected for years of service and proven bravery, kept away from the general fighting that ground down ordinary regiments. They received higher pay, better equipment, and better food. Napoleon's reserve of last resort, held back until the moment he could decide a battle. In 11 years of existence, he had never been broken in battle. Enemies called them the Immortals. French soldiers called them grognards, the grumblers, because these were men who had served long enough and fought hard enough that they could complain within an earshot of the emperor and get away with it. It was not an insult, it was a title. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, Napoleon sent them in, 5 battalions. Most historians believe they were middle guard. Advanced up the slope into assault columns toward Wellington's center right. A rumor ran through the French army. La Garde va attaquer. The Guard is attacking. One Allied officer of the ridge described them as a wall of bearskins moving uphill with mechanical regularity. Even men who had been fighting for 8 hours went quiet after they saw it. If the Guard was going in, this was a crisis. Wellington had anticipated it. He had positioned Major General Maitland's 1st Brigade of Foot Guards on the reverse slope, lying down in the grain, invisible to the advancing columns. As the Guard crested the ridge and began dressing its ranks for the final push, Wellington gave the order, the exact words debated ever since, but the effect was not. "Stand up, Guards! Make ready! Fire!" Maitland's guards rose from the grain and delivered a volley into the Guard columns at roughly 50 yards range. The leading battalion staggered, halted, tried to deploy into line. And then something happened that no French soldiers on that field had ever seen. The Guard began to retreat. Maitland's volley stopped them. Then Colonel John Colborne did something no one had ordered him to do. He swung his regiment, the 52nd Light Infantry, out of the Allied line and hit the Guard column from the side, caught in fire from the front and the flank at the same time. The column fell apart. La Garde recule! The Guard is retreating. Those 3 words passing through the French army in the dusk destroyed it. The Guard did not retreat. The Guard could not retreat. If the Guard was retreating, the battle was lost. The discipline that had held French units together through a day of catastrophic losses dissolved in minutes. What had been an army became a mob. Wellington raised his hat from the ridge and swept it forward. The Allied army, which had been absorbing punishment for 8 straight hours, came down the slope at last. The French army did not withdraw. It disintegrated. Units that had maintained cohesion through cavalry charges, artillery fire, and grinding attrition lost it in minutes when news of the Guard's retreat spread. Men threw away their weapons and ran. Officers lost control. The road south became choked with a panicking mass of men, horses, and abandoned guns. Napoleon briefly formed a square of old guard around himself and tried to stem the rout. Then was persuaded by his staff to leave the field before he was captured. He rode south in the darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of the army he had rebuilt in 90 days. The Prussian cavalry pursued through the night relentlessly. The pursuit was destructive than the battle itself for the fleeing French. By morning, the Armée du Nord had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The battle cost roughly 25,000 French killed and wounded, with another 8,000 taken prisoners. Anglo-Allied losses ran to approximately 17,000. The Prussians lost around 7,000. In a single day and a 2-mile ridge in Belgium, roughly 50,000 men had fallen. Napoleon reached Paris 3 days later and abdicated on June 22, 1815, for the second time in 14 months. This time there will be no return. He surrendered to the British ship HMS Bellerophon and was transported to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena and never left the island. He died there on May 5, 1821, at 51 years old. Wellington and Blucher met that evening at a tavern called La Belle Alliance, Beautiful Alliance, on the ground where Napoleon had stood that morning. Blucher, who spoke no English, greeted Wellington in French. "Quelle affaire? What a business!" Wellington agreed entirely. The following morning, Wellington encountered the politician Thomas Creevey in Brussels. Creevey asked how he had gone. Wellington said quietly, and we try to imagine him with an English accent, "It has been a damned nice thing. The nearest run thing you ever saw in your life." Then he added, "By God, I don't think it would have been done if I had not been there." Napoleon spent 6 years on St. Helena perfecting his alibi, which amounted to everyone else had failed him. Grouchy was too slow, Ney was reckless, Jérôme was wasteful at Hougoumont. His generals had let him down. There is something to this, but considerably less than Napoleon claimed. The decision to detach Grouchy was Napoleon's, and so were the vague orders that made the detachment useless. The delay on the morning of the 18th was, again, Napoleon's call. The failure to exploit the crisis after La Haye Sainte fell when the Allied center was genuinely open, came in part from a battlefield that Napoleon was managing less sharply than the Napoleon of Austerlitz or Jena, for example. He was fortified and in poor health. Contemporary accounts describe periods of sluggishness and inactivity at his command post during a battle that demanded constant responsiveness. As for Ney's cavalry charges, they were a catastrophic error, and Napoleon, watching from his headquarters, allowed them to continue long past the point where any clear-eyed assessments would have called them off. He cannot be absolved of that. But the deeper answer is structural. Napoleon needed to destroy both Allied armies before they could combine. He came close, but not close enough. Wellington's position was formidable. His defensive skill was genuine, and his army, for all its mixed quality, fought with extraordinary tenacity. The Prussians came. The Guard failed. An army that requires a sequence of things to go right is always at the mercy of the one that goes wrong. You just watched thousands of cavalry break on a wall of bayonets. You watched artillery decide whether a man could attack at all. You watched a single farmhouse hold up an entire battle for 6 hours. That is the world of 1815. It is not the world of 1777. When Daniel Morgan's riflemen picked off British officers at Saratoga, like we saw in our previous episode, they were using long rifles, accurate out to 200 yards, deadly in the hands of men who knew the forests of Virginia and Pennsylvania. The battle was fought in trees, in small groups, at close range, across terrain that swallowed entire armies. The numbers were in the thousands. At Waterloo, the numbers are in the tens of thousands, and the battlefield is open farmland where everyone can see everything and artillery can reach anyone. The standard weapon of both sides is still the smoothbore musket, accurate to perhaps 75 yards, reloaded fast enough to maintain volley fire, designed to be fired in mass volleys by men standing shoulder to shoulder in tight formations. Individual accuracy matters less than volume. The man next to you matters as much as the man in front of you. You live or die as a unit, not as a marksman. Artillery had changed the most. At Saratoga, cannons were a logistical problem. Burgoyne dragged 130 of them through the forest and they slow him to a crawl. At Waterloo, Napoleon had 246 guns, and they are the backbone of his attack. A well-handed battery firing round shot can destroy a regiment in minutes. Round shot is a solid iron ball that hits the ground and bounces through packed infantry formations, taking limbs with it and with every skip, which is why Wellington hit his men on the reverse slope, and which is why Napoleon waited for the ground to dry, which is why the rain the night before was not a minor inconvenience. It was a tactical factor that shaped the entire battle. And then there is the cavalry. At Saratoga, cavalry barely existed in any meaningful sense. The terrain made it useless. At Waterloo, thousands of horsemen charged up a slope in formation, and are stopped not by terrain, not by firearms, but by a tactical response that the terrain of Saratoga made impossible. The infantry square, 4 ranks of men facing outward on every side, bayonets fixed, standing their ground while horses circle them and cannot break through. It works only if the infantry holds its nerve, and only if no artillery of supporting infantry arrives to pry it open. Ney gave them neither. The squares held. 38 years separate Saratoga and Waterloo, and in that time the scale of war tripled. The role of artillery transformed the battlefield, and the tactics of infantry, cavalry, and guns became so interdependent that a single arm used alone, as Ney proved, could destroy itself against a prepared defense. The weapons had evolved. The lesson was the same. Coordination wins. Isolation kills. Waterloo ended the Napoleonic Wars. It did not undo what Napoleon had built. The Congress of Vienna had already completed its work before the battle was fought. The territorial settlement was essentially done. What Waterloo ensured was that it would hold, that Napoleon could not restart the wars, could not fracture the coalition, could not negotiate from a position of strength. The conservative order the Congress had constructed was confirmed. For France, the defeat was shattering in the short term and complicated in the long run. The Bourbons returned, but the ideas Napoleon had spread across Europe, the Napoleonic Code, the idea that government should be organized by rules rather than the whim of kings, The principle that talent, not birth, determined advancement survived in the institutions of the very nations that had beaten him. France itself would have 3 more revolutions before the century ended. For Britain, Waterloo confirmed dominance at sea and influence across the globe. The Royal Navy was already the world's most powerful force. The 19th century would be a British one. The human cost for the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815 is estimated at between 3.5 and 6 million military deaths, with comparable civilian losses from famine and disease. Waterloo did not end a minor conflict. It ended one of the most destructive European wars in history, a level of violence that would not be matched until August 1914. But let's go to our hypothetical scenarios, our section of the road not taken. History remembers Waterloo as inevitable. Well, it was not. Each scenarios that I'll present you represent a separate fork in the road and not a chain. They don't stack, and any one of them on its own changes the outcome. Let's follow the hinge 4 times. What if Blucher had broken at Ligny? June 16th, evening. Their lone corps, instead of marching between 2 battlefields, arrives at Ligny in time to strike the Prussian flank as Napoleon intended. The blow falls on a force already engaged frontally. Blucher's army is not merely beaten, it is broken. In a true rout rather than a fighting retreat, a shattered force almost certainly falls back toward its own supply base at Namur, not northwest toward Wavre and Wellington. There is no Prussian army at Waterloo. Wellington stands alone with 68,000 men against Napoleon's full strength. He fights the same defensive battle on the same ridge. But when Haye Sainte falls in the early evening, there is no Prussian relief arriving on the flank. No fresh troops pressing from the east. Wellington's thin center breaks. The Anglo-Allied army retreats toward Brussels. Napoleon's wins. The coalition fractures. Britain has lost an army in the field. Austria and Russia, still weeks away, seek terms rather than continue a war that has just proved Napoleon can still win. The settlement is not 1815 as we know it. Perhaps an exhausted negotiated peace that leaves Napoleon on the throne of a reduced France. The century that follows is not the same century, all of this, because one corps arrived in time or didn't. What if Grouchy had marched to the guns? June 18th, mid-morning, Grouchy hears the distant cannon at Waterloo. General Gerard urges him, marchez au canon. In our world, Grouchy refuses. He follows his orders to Wavre. In the other world, he listens. He turns west, leaving only a small holding force to keep watch at Wavre. But what he does is not reinforce Napoleon's center. He intercepts the Prussian march. Bülow's 4th Corps, moving toward Waterloo from the east, runs into 33,000 French troops somewhere between Wavre and the battlefield. Instead of arriving on Napoleon's flank in the late afternoon, the Prussians are fighting Grouchy in the open, miles short of Waterloo. The two-front battle that broke Napoleon never opens. Plancenoit never falls under Prussian pressure. The Guard attacks without a collapsing right flank behind it. Does Napoleon certainly win? No. But remove the Prussian arrival entirely and a battle Wellington called the nearest run thing of his life becomes something else, a fight he may not be able to hold. What if Napoleon instead attacked at dawn? The rain stops before dawn on June 18th. The ground is wet, but not yet the bog it will become. Napoleon chooses not to wait. He attacks at first light, hours before the Prussians can possibly close the distance from Wavre. His artillery struggles on the still wet ground, but he gains 5 crucial hours, and something else the script of history never gave him. Several of Wellington's units were still marching through the right to reach the ridge position. A dawn assault catches the Allied line only partially assembled, before the gaps are filled and the reserves are in place. Wellington's would be defending a position he had not yet finished building. By the time the first Prussian columns appear on the eastern horizon, Wellington has been fighting since dawn with an incomplete line, no relief, and a forced ground past its limit. Napoleon gambled on the weather and the ground. It was not a foolish gamble. The cost was the one resource he could not afford to spend: time. What if Ney had coordinated his attacks? It is 3:30 in the afternoon. Ney sees movements on the ridge and concludes Wellington is retreating. In our world, he launches cavalry with no infantry, no horse artillery, no coordination. In the other world, Ney waits 30 minutes. He brings up horse artillery and opens fire on the squares at close range before a single horseman moves. A square under artillery fire cannot hold its shape indefinitely. Men fall, gaps open, the formation begins to fall apart. That is the moment the cavalry goes in. Infantry in support closes off any retreat. Squares that held against cavalry alone cannot hold against both at once. The center cracks, the cavalry finds the gap instead of breaking itself on unbroken infantry. Ney had the right instinct at the right moment. Wellington's center was genuinely vulnerable. What Ney lacked was not courage. He had more courage than was useful. What he lacked was 30 minutes of patience. For decisions, any one of them goes differently, and Napoleon doesn't fall at Waterloo, he walks away from it. History gave him none of them. The corps commander followed his orders. The cavalry marshal didn't wait. The rain came at the wrong time, and an old general on broken bones kept a promise. We think of Waterloo as the end of something inevitable, the last stand of a man who had already lost. But the men on that ridge on the morning of June 18th didn't know that. They knew only that the ground was wet, the army across the valley was real, and that before dark, one of them would cease to exist. That is what history actually is, not the verdict, the day before the verdict, when it could still go either way. Next time we will go to July 1863, Gettysburg. I will see you on the next battlefield. Bye.